Hi, Optimizers. This is JJ Ruescas, and this is another episode of Optimizing Me or Optimizándome, the show with top performer guests from whom we'll learn about their stories, their ups and downs, their habits, routines, and mostly their mindset. Our guest today is a shaman from the Andean Amazonian traditions. His skill is a translation of the silent messages that sacred plants like ayahuasca, Tabaco, San Pedro, and others utter to human beings. He is indeed a connector between ancient healing technologies and the modern world. This is especially helpful in situations where modern medicine cannot heal spiritual wounds. His curiosity led him not only to embrace South American mysticism, but also philosophies like Buddhism, Alchemy, Zen, Tantra, and others. His wise words produce a profound introspection in those who listen to them. I'm very excited about this conversation because he's one of my go tos when talking about altered states of consciousness. Without further ado, let me introduce you to the shaman, Xuan Gwar. Hey, Juan, how is it going?
Hello, my friend. Hello, everyone who's watching this.
And I'm so happy to get you back here. We had one of the first episodes with you in Spanish in Bolivia, and now we are almost 2 years apart. So let's catch up with what has happened in 2 years. First, who's Juan War? What does it mean to be a shaman?
Okay, heavy questions. So, who's Xuan Gwar? First of all, Xuan Gwar is not my birth name due to legal reasons, given that some of the work that I perform around the world still has certain legal stigma. I'd rather not connect my passport name to my given name. Um, and this happens a lot in shamanism that people kind of present themselves with a new name, which I accept, and I think it's very good for some people who experience a rebirth to to mark the moment in which they changed and assume a new name. I believe in second birth and in new beginnings. In my case, my name is just a pure formality. Um, so that's about the name. Now, if you ask who is behind that name, I don't really know. And I think I don't have the interest of knowing anymore. As if I were trying to identify myself with a particular narrative or with a particular story. For many years, I wanted to be a shaman because I thought it was the. I actually didn't want to be a shaman. I'm just telling the story in the way that I can. But I did have this projection that the shaman was the most that a man could be. However, I am more interested today in being a man. I think that being a man is actually the most vital, most necessary, and something that is sometimes lacking. So, although I am a shaman, I think that first of all, my real answer would be that I am a man, and everything that happens after is something that we have to see. And the second question regarding what is shamanism is a question that I get asked a lot. And I feel that whomever is asked a similar question regarding their vital interest will have a lot to say about it. And in the practice of saying a lot about it, will have condensed or will have found an appropriate phrase that pinpoints on whatever practice they do. So whether if you ask a Buddhist, what is Buddhism? It's the same. I mean, we can talk for days, for years about Buddhism, but there are ways that each practitioner or each master has to condense what their training is and to express it bluntly. So, to express it bluntly, I would say that shamanism is the techniques that allow ourselves to understand that the mysteries of the universe reside in the human body. So, whomever has any practice that seeks to relate the microcosm, that being our physical body, By physical body, I also include the psychological sphere and the spiritual sphere, of course. So, whomever is trying to bridge the gap or to somehow relate the cosmos with the vehicle that we are incarnating, and whomever is practicing techniques to find that the soul of the universe is identical to the soul of man, I would say that that person is practicing shamanism. So, whatever practice one has to accomplish this, I would call it a shamanic practice. For example, there are some paths which are intellectual, right? So we could refer to the intellectual paths as if they were religions. So one can read the Bible or read the Quran or read the sutras, and there is a special, I would call it, there is a sort of mind training that has to do with that endeavor. But that endeavor does not necessarily, it does not apply any practice. It is merely reading, understanding, believing in some cases. Now, when these religions, whether they be from the Islamic world or from Buddhism or from Hinduism or from Native American traditions or from Aboriginal traditions from the world, from Siberia to Australia, whatever those techniques are, I would call them shamanism, and so would have Mircea Eliade, for example, which was um, an anthropologist of the last century that was fundamental in bringing forth shamanism into a contemporary sphere. So, aside from identifying shamanism with whatever practice I have, I I think that the best definition is that shamanism is the practice of the techniques that seek to find that the mysteries of the universe can be found in the human body.
Hmm. Now, what I hear is that there are so many traditions as probably cultures have existed in the history, and nowadays those ones are starting to get re-emerging or maybe becoming more public to the modern times where we are mostly reigned by psychological or by standards that were very different from the traditions, from the traditional and the traditions, if I mean that way, right? So, what are those traditions that, for example, you have come from and that impermeate the majority of the work that you do?
That's a great question. Let me see. Ingrained in that question, there's something that I would like to point out first. That when we talk about religion and shamanism, we appear to be talking about two different things, right? I don't really think that's the case, but we have somewhat of a chicken and egg paradox, and the paradox is whether religion invented shamanism or whether shamanism invented religion. And to understand this, one needs to stop looking at these two things as if they're separate. If you ask me personally, I cannot answer whether the theory predates the practice or whether the practice predates the theory. I find that it's very similar to the study of mythology and ritual in anthropology. For example, we have myths that tell a story, and then we find in those same cultures certain rituals that produce the myth or reenact the myth. And we could say, well, there was this myth first and there was this story, and then we had rituals that would confirm it to the people. But we also could believe that there were first some rituals that appeared by themselves, and the myth that was told after generations came from that ritual too. So instead of seeing a sort of clash or a dualism between religion and shamanism, as if we're talking about theory and practice, we can understand them as the same link that mythology and ritual have. So these come in they come together. What we can say, though, is that both religion and shamanism, which shamanism as the practices of any religious or spiritual theory, or as a religion itself being the theoretical part of any spiritual practice, these are all idiosyncratic and they are all cultural. So they appear in certain time and in certain geography and in certain a certain given people. So in the same way that we cannot subtract the mythology of the Native Americans from the Native American condition, in the same way we cannot separate shamanism from whichever lineage or whichever tradition comes from. Having said that, I was not born under any cultural mythology, under any um, religion, or I was, to put it bluntly, I was not ordained for this path from the beginning. But instead, I had very strong roots in both my families on my father's side and my mother's side, that they had been carrying certain ancestral knowledge from their own blood, in this case, mostly Celtic. But one thing that uh, placed me in this path very strongly, and particularly in the path of looking for other traditions, because it's very rare that you will find, for example, a Buddhist that is born a Buddhist that will eventually endeavor into discovering the truth of Christianity. And it's very strange that you will have Christian priests that are born to it that are eventually called to Buddhism. And in this case, I'm also reminded by a very ancient treatise that is called the Treatise of Abramelin the Mage. Abramelin the Mage was a Judean ascetic that was the master of a Jew called Abraham of Worms. I don't remember exactly what time this happened in, but I think it was in the 1300s. And when Abraham of Worms left his native city and voyaged to Jerusalem and met this ascetic master, this master, Abramelin the Mage, said that if you are born under any religion, he recommends fervently that one pursues the path that that religion prescribes, because all religions can lead you to the ultimate goal. And if you doubt the religion you are born in, you will doubt any other religion. So instead of rejecting the religion that you're born and then finding truths in other religions and being disillusioned by those truths, what is happening is that this very person that is seeking is actually not having the necessary amount of faith. And faith is something that we really do practice. So I don't know, and perhaps if I would have had a very Christian family, perhaps I would have defined myself as a complete Christian. Or if I was born under a Buddhist family, I would be only a Buddhist. However, I do feel that some of the conditions and circumstances that in a way nourished my path are something that are part of the contemporary condition and circumstances of others also. And what is happening, particularly in this century and in the last couple of decades, is that we have broken this contact with our traditions. So you can have, for example, a European descendant being born in Argentina that traveled to the Andes and the Amazon to seek a new tradition. But in this case, it's not a new tradition. It was trying to find something that would speak directly of myself. And I feel that nowadays we have this idea that we go and seek masters or lineages, or we identify with certain different paths and we make them part of our narrative because we feel that we are rootless, that we don't come from anywhere. So instead of using these paths to understand what I said in the beginning, this connection between the soul of the human being and the soul of the universe, instead we just collect different traditions and we make them part of our ego. And that's something that I had to identify and to battle a lot with. However, if we also understand the conditions that we are mostly born in nowadays, and I use myself as an example, the first thing that I wanted to do was to get in contact with the tradition of my forefathers. So I traveled to the British Isles in the hope of discovering and getting into contact with a real druidic lineage. And what I found was that even though there are many people that call themselves druids, that there are many actually, I've met many druids themselves. They are what they are due to the connection that they have to the earth and to their blood. But I did not find any unbroken lineage of transmission that came from the ancient times to today. So if one has, for example, European blood and is looking to have a deeper connection with where we come from, if one would try to seek those traditions, I think that one would be vastly disappointed, because even though there is a huge uprising and a huge revolution and a huge movement of bringing the understanding of our forefathers back into our time, there is no unbroken lineage of transmission such as one can find in Aboriginal cultures that have kept these lineages of transmission intact. And for me, that has been something very important. I think that whatever I could learn of my own body by myself could take me a lifetime. But if I learn from those who have experimented with their bodies for the past 5,000 years, then I would be, in effect, be standing on the shoulders of giants. This is the great phrase of Newton when they asked him, how did you get to this discovery? Well, what I did was stand in the shoulders of giants. And if we are to disregard the tradition, and if we are to disregard 5,000 years as is the minimum that we can ascribe to Andean Amazonian shamanism, or 2,600 years, which is the minimum also that we should ascribe to any Buddhist tradition, then we see that by receiving a lineage that has passed the test of time, we are not only using our own body to discover the things that we can discover, but we're also using the experimentation, the knowledge, and the practice of thousands of people that have maintained these lineages. So even though when I was young, I felt in myself certain qualities that would have allowed me to discover many shamanic techniques of reconnection by my own self, I also thought that it was completely arrogant to disregard 5,000 years or 2,600 years, or in the case of Sikhism, 600 years, it doesn't matter. But to disregard proven lineages seemed ludicrous and seemed to be arrogant. So one of my main interests was to, in effect, get into contact with these lineages of verified transmission that have produced saintly or enlightened or powerful beings in whatever way these lineages describe them, to test the teachers and to become part of these lineages. And this is something that can only happen for people that have conditions such as I have, that were not born in any particular tradition, and instead, by the huge disgrace of not having a solid foundation, we actually have the great opportunity to learn from different traditions, learn from different transmissions, and to be able to scope the whole spectrum of religious practice, or what we would call shamanism, from peoples all around the world.
Wow. So lineage. So we were talking first about religion as the theoretical part and shamanism as the practical side of spirituality. Am I on the same path so far? Or cool.
Yes.
Now, this lineage or the different lineages or traditions, how do they kept alive after so many years with so many variations there? What has been your experience in tracing those ones and actually also figuring out which one resonates for you?
Yes, there are two very interesting points there. The first is, how did these lineages survive? And the second is, how did I choose whatever lineage I inherited, or how did I go about it? So, to answer the first question, I would say that the only reason why these lineages survived until our days is through secrecy. Okay? What would happen if we have, for example, I'll give you an example. When we're talking about this dichotomy between the theoretical and the practical aspect of spirituality, which we could separate into religion and shamanism, for example, the lineage of transmission of practical um, techniques in Judaism was largely the Merkaba tradition. And then in about the 1300s began the Kabbalistic movement. The Kabbalistic movement is also what we would call the esoteric aspect, right? So esoteric means that it is kept within, and exoteric is that it is shown outside. So when we look at a religion, or a lineage of transmission and a mythology with all its rituals, we could look, for example, at Judaism, and we could say that Judaism is or for example, the Torah is the exoteric aspect of that religion, and the esoteric aspect is the very secret transmission of the Merkaba lineage. If we would say the same of, for example, Buddhism, we would say that the exoteric aspect of Buddhism are the teachings of the Buddha, which are called the sutras, or the sutras begin with saying, "Thus have I heard." So they come from what the Buddha said. But the esoteric transmission of Buddhism is Tantra. And Tantra were secret practices that were kept secret by transmitting them from from teacher to student, and the student had to abide by very particular laws and had to prove himself through various tests to actually receive these initiations. The same thing we could say of all the religions of the world. For example, Sufism is the esoteric aspect of Islam. Um, and
What about Christianity?
Well, Christianity, that's a very good point. I would say that the esoteric aspect of Christianity in its beginning was Gnosticism. Gnosticism,
Mm.
however, was highly repressed by the church, particularly after the Second Council of Nicaea, in which the Christian religion took on a very stiff and fixated form, which it did not have before. So, a lot of the things that we're discussing also actually come from the apparent repression that Judeo Christian traditions have exerted on other beliefs. In this case, not particularly Judaism, or at least not Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple, but if we are to think of the two religions that have um, proselytized their message more and that have converted people more, we would be talking about Islam and Christianity. So we are coming from the past 2,000 years of Christianity, in which Christianity has done all it was able to do to suppress any other practices. However, for example, we find nowadays priests talking about the evils of paganism, for example, but then they are praying to candles and blowing candles. And the very act of blowing candles is a pagan tradition, right? So, in even in Christianity, there are esoteric aspects. So, for example, we have esoteric aspects of Christianity in the training of exorcists, for example, which is a teaching
Mm.
that is not widely given, is very reserved, is kept only for very particular circumstances and elements. So,
Mm.
how was it that the esoteric aspects of all these religions survived? They survived due to the secrecy they were clothed in. If any of these traditions would not have been kept secret, then they would have been very quickly corrupted. Because we see, for example, we are not talking the same English that existed even 400 years ago. If we read Shakespeare, very few people can read Shakespeare in the original English, and that's not even Old English. If you try to read the poem of Beowulf that is written in Old English, most people just, it runs completely by your head. So if we take into account that language changes so fast, then what would be the way in which an esoteric tradition would survive without any corruption? It would be impossible unless there would be a transmission of a fixated language that could survive the maelstrom of the vicissitudes of fate. And this is something that we find a lot in all of these transmissions. They are sometimes related to a particular language. So when we think about, for example, esoteric Christianity, the language of esoteric Christianity is Latin. So if you want to study the exorcist ritual of Christian priests, you need to read the Ritual Romanum, and it's, well, unless you get an English copy that does exist nowadays, that transmission would have been kept in Latin, and you would have to learn Latin. So in the medieval times, very few people knew Latin, and whomever studied Latin had access to this esoteric knowledge. In the same case, Sanskrit was the esoteric language by excellence of India that not only preserved the tantras in the Hindu tradition, but also the tantras of the Buddhist tradition. So it seems to me that the biggest impact in keeping these traditions alive, or basically that the fact that they survive to our days, has to do with this, with secrecy, with testing the students that are about to receive this transmission, and to the strain of a particular language in which the practice is being affected. So if I may, I can do a comparison of four different esoteric aspects. We could talk about Judaism, and the Torah has suffered various translations and retranslations, and even the Torah itself was not the book of the Torah as we know it now, and the selection of the book, which is particular because it is a particular selection. When I think it was in the second or third century after Christ that the Torah was put together, some books made it to the Torah and some books didn't. For example, the books of Enoch are left out. In the same case, Christianity, after the Second Council of Nicaea, they chose some books to belong to the Bible and some other books they called apocryphal. So those are out. And both the knowledge of Hebrew is fundamental for both the Merkaba and the Kabbalistic traditions. The knowledge of Latin is fundamental for any esoteric Christian understanding. The same happens in Tantra, both in Hindu and Buddhist Tantra, which the knowledge of Sanskrit by the technique of mantra is fundamental to bring these practices into effect. And finally, I would say that the same happens in shamanism, because the teacher has to test the student, has to really trust that the student is someone who is qualified, capable, and has been chosen by powers beyond both the teacher and the student. And the transmission is given in the form of songs. And these songs are in the particular language that this transmission is coming from. So you can receive songs from the Shipibo tradition called Icaros, or you can receive songs from the Quechua tradition, sometimes Icaros, sometimes called Mariris, and etc., etc., etc. So it seems to be that the strongest candidates for those aspects that allowed these lineages to come into our times are secrecy, testing the people that want to enter the lineage, and to have a lineage of transmission of a particular language. Sometimes in the form of songs, sometimes in the form of prayer, sometimes in the form of mantra. But in the same case as the Icaros are the sacred voice of shamanism, or Amazonian shamanism, in the same way that mantra is the sacred voice in the Hindu and Buddhist tradition, and in the same way that ancient Hebrew and its Kabbalistic interactions are the sacred voice in Judaism, without studying any of these, one cannot say that one belongs to that esoteric lineage. And for one to be able to say this, one does need to put in a lot of work to be tested, allow oneself to be tested, triumph over these challenges, and eventually maintain the same level of secrecy that one's teachers imparted to you.
And I guess at some point later, send or convey the tradition or the secrecy to the next generation, and so on.
Yes, exactly. Without that, the tradition would die. One even has the, let's call it, the responsibility to pass it on. These traditions are not something that we endeavor to receive to keep them for ourselves, but at some point, by the very act of receiving it, one becomes a link in the transmission. So it's something very sad that any person that has mastered any technique that can be truthfully called a master would die without any disciples, because that means that that lineage is broken. And there have been so many broken lineages in this earth. Actually, there are very few that have actually survived. Most lineages of transmission did not survive. The transmission and the esoteric knowledge of the Essenes did not survive. Neither did that of the early Gnostics, etc., etc. So, if we really think about it, we have lost most of the spiritual practices that this world has brought forth. However, that might not need to disillusion us, because still there are some veritable, ancient, and fantastic lineages of transmission that we still can receive.
Mm. Okay, now this is a super silly question, but how does a Luke Skywalker becomes a shaman in this situation? We have a Padawan, right? Someone who would like to, or who's called to, or I don't know, is this person he or she called to, or a shaman points them out, or what happens? How do we become shamans?
That's a very interesting question. There are multiple stories that I can tell you to break the fixation that there is any one way that this thing happens, right? So, for example, you have a saint from last century, and he was not a saint, he was just a very, we could say, spiritual person. And then he went. To a woman. This woman was called Hazrat Babajan, and this woman, which was a very powerful yogi, she kissed him in the forehead, and that completely awakened him into the path. And eventually, that person became Meher Baba. Or we, for example, just to use your very example, Luke Skywalker had in his very life the circumstances to be part of the cosmic battle that was happening, right? And even though Star Wars is a movie, it also carries a lot of archetypes in the path that can be used as examples. So if the question is, how is one to get into this path? I really don't know. I can't tell, because I know shaman from many walks of life, and they all came into this path in different ways. One thing that I can attest to is that to become a shaman, one needs to put a lot of effort. One needs eventually to become disillusioned with the idea of becoming anything. And finally, one has to be chosen by powers that transcend both the student and the a master. So it's not so much that a master will point you out and say, you have the qualities, come here, I'll teach you. That can happen, but perhaps it's not just the master who is doing this. Perhaps it's this transcendental force producing this circumstance for the student to enter the path. Or it can be something as simple as Hazrat Babajan's kiss. Or it can be something that leads a person to receive this knowledge not so much by any stretch of desire or attempt towards omnipotency, because this happens a lot. No, we want to understand the world, we want to find truth. In a way, we want to sit in the throne of heaven. We want to know all. We want to find that ultimate truth and sit in that throne. And in the beginning, that seems like a very loable thing to do. But somehow in the middle, that desire begins to be seen as what it is, a desire. And that desire is somewhat corrupted, and it has veiled this very subtle aspect of arrogance, which is that in the pursuit of truth, one is trying to sit in the throne of heaven. And at some point, one also has to agree with reality, which is that we are not meant to know everything. We are not meant to inherit all spiritual doctrines. We are just meant to walk the life that we are meant to walk. So, if the only way to get into shamanism is walking the life that you're meant to walk, there is no particular set of steps that I could mention. It is not as if this is a university. You know, a university can give a curriculum of classes and say, well, first year you do this, this, and this, and in 4 years you end up and you're an engineer. That does not happen in shamanism. That does not happen in Buddhism. That does not happen in, well, maybe it happens in the church. I actually don't know.
A certified priest, probably at this time.
Yes, well, things like that do exist, of course. There are corrupted branches of shamanism, there are corrupted branches of Christianity, Buddhism, etc. I'm sure there are some people that are selling shamanic titles or certifications. That is worth nothing, absolutely nothing. And in fact, to feel any sense of safety or of accomplishment by any title is opposed to the very self discovery that these particular paths seek to inspire. Um, so it's a very complicated question. I know that the people that are listening to this talk right now are going like, well, you know, I wanted to enter this path, but you're not giving me any way to do that.
No,
So
this is good because what I wanted to point out is that I also know several shamans, like you said, they come from all walks of life. The stories that you are bringing right now are complementing other ones that I had because there is no university, like you said, there is no curriculum for this or path. Now, what I wanted to ask or to even move the conversation a little bit is that if it doesn't matter how someone has arrived to the path or started the path, what are the ways that a shaman in his or her own way starts getting tested?
that's a good question. Um, One is tested by the path and by the teacher. So, for example, in shamanism, one learns a lot from the plants and from nature and from the animals and from the places that one visit and from sacred stones and from pilgrimage. And one is tested by these things, of course. Every pilgrimage is a test. Surviving in the jungle is a test, etc. But the most important aspect that is constantly testing us is that of our own teacher. Because the teacher is there not so much to teach. Actually, that's a huge, sometimes it's a misunderstanding, but the teacher is not so much there to teach. The teacher is there to keep your ego in check and to be able, the teacher is someone that we give the power over us for them to be able to stick the finger on a wound. Now, if anyone else, if I have a wound and you come and you put your finger in my wound, I will immediately become defensive. No? So if any person from any walks of life comes to you and says, well, you shouldn't do this, you should do this or that, you immediately become defensive and you go like, wow, no, that's you, I do what I want, etc., etc. So we never find, we are never in a teachable place because we are always keeping the defenses of our ego with our guard up. So the teacher is someone towards whom we lower that guard and we allow them this sacred opportunity, which is for them to point out our limitations and for us to work on those limitations in a compassionate, sometimes also a wrathful manner. So the teacher is fundamental as much as one can learn from plants. Anyone that is learning from plants but does not have the vital and very much necessary aspect of a teacher to keep their ego in check will eventually run into trouble. Um,
Mm.
so that is fundamental. If I can give any universal advice would be this: if you're interested in any path, the first thing you want to do is find a teacher. And after you find a teacher, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism, there are various stages of one's relation with a teacher. The first stage is to test the teacher. We are not meant to merely go to anyone that presents himself, whether they be or not, as a teacher and take them as they come, but we are meant to test the teacher. Once we test the teacher, we listen to the teacher. And thirdly, we become imitating the teacher. And fourthly, the imitation has dissolved and we ourselves have become a teacher. So, for that to happen, even in Tibetan Buddhism, I remember that Jigmet Limpa, a great yogi of the, I think, 18th century, wrote, or was it Dilgo Rinpoche? I don't know, but anyway, it doesn't matter in Buddhism because, truth is universal. But in their case, they said that the most valuable pith instruction is the one that brings your limitations to the light. So whenever a teacher tells you something that you don't want to hear, that is the instruction you have to heed the most. And that is actually the teacher's blessing and compassion. But nowadays, that's very hard to do. It's very hard. About, I don't know, not even 200 years ago, but for the whole ancient times, let's say that you wanted to be a shoemaker and you wanted to be the best shoemaker. What you would do would be finding the best shoemaker, knocking on his door, bowing on his door, and say, "Please, can I be taken as an apprentice? I will do everything. I don't need pay. I just want to learn." Right? And the shoemaker might close the door and say, "No, go away. I have no need of assistance," etc. And you still have to remain at that doorstep and keep knocking without food, under the rain. And this same metaphor applies for Zen Buddhist monasteries as for some aspects in shamanism. But we do not have, and when I mean we, I mean society as it's being conformed nowadays, people don't have the level of faith to do something like this. So instead of testing a teacher and completely allowing ourselves to walk the path and to really be able to surrender our willpower and put it in the hands of somebody else, we always want to be in control. And that's very difficult. That, in a way, is an obstacle towards the purity of the transmission lineage. Because we say, "Oh, I'll listen to you as long as I am doing what I want." But when things get difficult, I will choose to go when I want to. And those are the most important challenges. And these challenges a student has to pass one, two times, three times, maybe more. So there are many times in which the student will feel that the teacher is being mean to them, or that they need to go, or that there's someone even more powerful. That's a very complicated way of seeing things, and say, "Oh, well, I've learned enough from you. I'm going out with this other person." And we might end up being what Chogyam Trungpa, the great Tibetan Buddhist master that was one of the first ones in building temples in the States, talked about when he was pointing out people's, and particularly our contemporary age, spiritual materialism. So as long as you are taking the shots, as long as you go to a teacher and you listen, but you reserve for yourself the ultimate decision whether to follow or not, you don't have a teacher. A teacher is someone towards whom you have completely surrendered your willpower. That surrendering of the willpower does not need to last forever, but it does need to last for the period of time until your ego is sufficiently humiliated and debased, until you see it for what it is, a limitation. And we cease to keep the guard of our ego up, and we bring it down, and at that moment we truly become teachable.
And that is the beginning.
That is the beginning. Exactly. You said it right. That is the beginning. I mean, you have not learned anything until you did that. But once
Wow.
you learn how to do that, the path goes really fast. And you would be surprised how much knowledge and wisdom you can absorb when you don't have your egoic narrative trying to analyze and trying to keep for itself the ultimate truth. It is very much
Mm,
like with judging teachers. Some people say, my teacher is enlightened, your teacher is not enlightened, this person is enlightened. But if we analyze this very statement, this would make us the judge of the enlightened. This would
yeah.
make us even more powerful than the enlightened. We are the one that appoint them. So it
Uh,
is highly ludicrous to keep this attitude. And instead of looking for the teacher with the ultimate power or for an enlightened being that in effect we do not know whether they are or not, we go back to the second question that you asked, which was about preference. And I always recommend people to go with their preference. This is very much like listening to music. If you, let's say that you had never listened to any music at all, and I tell you, okay, there are 10,000 trillion songs, pick one. And you're suddenly baffled because you don't know which step to take because there are infinite steps. No, it's kind of like if you would bring an Australian Aborigine to a supermarket in the States
supermarket.
and you tell
Yeah.
them, okay, pick what you're going to have tonight for food. You have no idea. So, preference is something that works with our own condition. So if this aborigine says, well, for example, I like fish, well, then you go to the fish section, and that's very easy, right? Um, if with a teacher you feel like you like this person, liking a person is not does not mean that you think that he's enlightened or because he's more similar to you he is better than everyone else. No, but what it does present is that there is a link of similitude or similarity that you can work with, and it means also that communication will be smoother. So I recommend people always to work with preference. If you enter Tibetan Buddhism, you pick a teacher that you like. And if you have to eventually choose a particular deity to work with, you go with one that resounds more with you. If you are going to Andean Amazonian shamanism and you say, well, what songs am I going to know first? You go with the songs that you like, right? So there's a very good answer in this path. Whenever one asks a teacher, what am I supposed to be doing? Uh, a very universal answer would be do whatever works for you, right? So if you ask a teacher, should I do this mantra slowly or quickly or sonorous or mumbling? There are some mantras that, of course, have their particular forms of being said or vibrated, but the main answer would be just do what works, do what works for
Mm,
you. Go by your preference. So, in the same way that we choose music that we like and we want to sing music that we are connected to and that we even sing better, songs that have any connection with us, in the same way we will traverse quicker, and better any path that we have any foundation of preference with beforehand.
hmm. That makes sense. And, this part was super funny because you said an Aborigine that goes to the US to a supermarket. Guess what? I was the Bolivian Aborigine trying to find peanut butter. That was it.
Brother, the same happened to me. I use that example because whenever I enter American supermarkets, I have no idea what to get. I mean, I need a little fruit shop or a vegetable shop, but sometimes, man, when man is crowded by options, we lose the power of choosing rightly. Why? Because we are obnubilated by the amount of choice possible. And
Mhm.
whenever that happens, one thing that we have to remind ourselves of is to go with what works.
Makes sense. And that is also called the paradox of choice. I'm trying to find out the name of the author of that one. Now, we're going to get back to this point, and I'm starting to realize how these things are going to get connected. So the first question that I have is, what makes shamanism a practical exercise, or what makes it so practical compared to the theoretical of religion?
Well, first of all, shamanism is absolutely practical. And in this respect is different from any other tradition. And I think that this is also why we mostly call Andean Amazonian shamanism shamanism as a whole. Even though the word is Siberian and there are other aspects of shamanism around the world, one thing that stands out in Andean Amazonian shamanism is that it doesn't have a fixated mythology. So if you go to Christianity, Christianity has its myth, right? In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and this Word became incarnate to liberate the souls of sentient beings. In Buddhism, you have also the myth of the Buddha. You know, there was this prince that got disillusioned with life, pursued many different practices, eventually went into himself and became enlightened. And so the same we have in Islam, the same we have every religion in a way has its cosmology and its mythology. And even though shamanism, of course that it has its cosmology and of course that it has its mythology, shamanism does not have a fixated cosmology or mythology. This means that we can always say what is Judaism and what is not. I mean, even though there are many factions of Judaism that are fighting between each other, there are many factions of Christianity that are fighting between each other, actually, there are more things in which they would agree than in which they would disagree. So, for example, both Pentecostals and Catholics would agree that Christ is the right hand of God sent into the world to purify the sins of mankind. And they would bicker and fight between lesser aspects, perhaps, right? So this happens because there is a foundational text. And we can always go to the Bible. We can interpret the Bible in different ways, but there's still a Bible. In shamanism, there's no Bible. And you can go to the Amazon and you can go with one tribe and ask, what is the foundational myth of your tribe? And they will tell you one myth. And then you'll go like, oh, okay, this is shamanism. It all comes from this myth. And then you go to another tribe and they tell you another myth. So this idea of the fixation of truth that happens in other religions, shamanism does not have it. And this is the main difference between mythology and religion. Even though all religion comes from mythology and eventually became fixated by the pressure of literature, so to say, shamanism, by having no sacred book, leaves the question of truth open. And a myth is not supposed to be true or untrue. A myth is supposed to create an effect. It doesn't matter if the story of the Shuar people's Adam and Eve called Kametsa and Narowe is real or not. We're not trying to get into history. The important thing is what effect does this story produce in the hearer. So in the same way, I would say that shamanism goes also with what works. And shamanism has very different myths, and these myths have to do with the various different traditions and societies that brought them forth. However, there is no one myth. And this is also the reason why nobody can tell you what shamanism really is. Because even though I have my way of telling you what shamanism is, I would never say this is what shamanism is. I'm only saying this is what I feel shamanism is, right? So by not having a book, it forces people to take the humble position of speaking from their own experience. Whereas when we're talking about mythology, we have to say things like Zeus was the god of lightning, and this is not up for discussion. In shamanism, everything is up for discussion because it doesn't really matter what theory or theoretical framework we have to understand what we're doing. In fact, shamanism does not have this. For example, you need to understand the myth of the Christ, and you need to understand the one particular myth of the whole Christian cosmology, which is the Last Supper, if you are to take the Eucharist, because the Eucharist is the transubstantiation of the body of Christ in that moment in the church, and it's a ritual that is reenacting the moment in which Christ parted the bread and said, "This is my body," and took the wine and said, "This is my blood." So, this is a very good example of showing how a ritual comes is related to mythology. However, for any person to undergo, for example, an ayahuasca ceremony in the Amazonian tradition, you do not need to be acquainted with any myth.
Mm.
You do need to be acquainted with the myth of the Last Supper to do the ritual of the Eucharist, right? But you do not need the foundation of any myth before you do any of the spiritual practices of Andean Amazonian shamanism. So in Andean Amazonian shamanism, it is very particular that we break the duality between the egg and the chicken. In this case, we do choose one, and it begins with ritual. Mythology comes from the plant itself, and you can receive a vision of the beginning of the world, and that vision will not necessarily be proven wrong or right by myself having any other vision. That means that your vision is the condition of your mind, and my vision is the condition of my mind. So in shamanism, there is very little room for the clash of ideologies. Different shaman from different ideologies, with different mythology, with different rituals, can all come together and practice together, which is
Yeah.
something that is very rare, and you will rarely find it in other traditions, right?
Mm.
It's very rare that, Catholics go to Pentecostal churches, or even Theravada Buddhist monks practice Tibetan Tantra. This does not happen. Even though they have the same original myth, they have differences along the way, and they have different myths that they reenact in their ritual. However,
Mm.
shamanism does not have that. So you are not meant to know anything before you step into the path. In fact, you begin to understand the cosmology that surrounds this practice, the practice of shamanism, by doing it. Whereas every other path, you would need to be acquainted with the foundations, whether that is the Quran or the Sutras or the Guru Granth Sahib Ji or the Lao Tzu, Tao Te Ching, anything else. So that
Mm.
is very particular of shamanism. It is a
Now,
non-theoretical transmission.
this is good entry to. We started already talking about plant medicines. Are so how do plant medicine, for people that are not aware of how they are used, or what is the context around this, and how they're used inside of shamanic practices, how do they relate?
I will explain this in a shamanic fashion, because shamanism is not only the practice, but every tradition has its way of explaining the world, right? So even though shamanism does not fixate it in any sort of way, I will give you a somewhat shamanic explanation that might not be entirely rational, but it does have its own inner consistency. So let's say that you want to get in contact with the spirit of an animal. Let's say that you want to get into contact with the spirit of a jaguar, right? I am, for example, sitting right now in
Mhm.
in one of my I would call totemic animals, with which I've had a relationship. So how does one go about this? First thing, we receive the name. The name is the first and foremost, right? So the name is Jaguar, let's say. Secondly, we need to understand its form, right? So we say, okay, the jaguar is a big cat. It is an apex predator in the jungle. It has spots. It lives mostly at night. It hunts at night. It sleeps in the trees, etc., etc. So not just identifying the animal by its shape, right? But its form involves all the ways in which that shape moves. So, for example, the jaguar is a great swimmer, is a great runner, and it can climb trees. All of this relates to its form. Then, thirdly, we would need to have a personal experience. And to get to that personal experience, we need to haunt the jaguar. And I say haunt, not hunt. And what do I mean by haunting? Haunting is becoming the jaguar. You are never going to see a jaguar in the jungle unless you become a jaguar. There is no way that you will be walking through the jungle and you will just surprise a jaguar and the jaguar will go like, oh my God, I was here doing my things and now you appeared. That does not happen. The jaguar is the king of the jungle and is completely aware of everything that's happening. And if he doesn't want you to see him, you won't see him. The only way in which you can get to see him is if you no longer are a person. The only way that you can see a jaguar is if you become a jaguar. So that means that you have to live at night, you have to be awake all night, you have to sleep during the day. You have to abandon the human form, and by this I mean many things of a shamanic, perhaps esoteric understanding, but I also mean things like not smelling like a person anymore. Because if you smell like a person, you will never get close to it. However, if you undergo particular diets to clean the toxins of your body, you will no longer give a human smell, and you might have a chance of passing unperceived and eventually meeting the jaguar. So, to be able to haunt a jaguar, you have to become a jaguar. You have to become somewhat of a jaguar ghost. And eventually, after pursuing this activity of becoming a jaguar, you might eventually see a jaguar face to face. And once you see a jaguar, that is a very powerful spiritual encounter which transforms your being and arguably also that of the jaguar. And there's a very interesting energetic symbiosis that happens between the two. So I began with this explanation not to go straight head first into plants, but to make an analogy. So in the same way, if you want to be acquainted with the spirit of a plant, how do you do it? You do it the same way as you do the jaguar. First, you need to know its name, right? So if we were in the jungle and we are talking about ayahuasca, for example, I would tell you the name ayahuasca. And then I tell you about its form. I tell you about its leaf. I tell you about that it's a liana. I don't know how to say it in English.
Vine.
A vine, exactly. Um, and then we would go out into the jungle, and you would have to find this medicine, right? You would have to find it by yourself. You need to know its leaf. You need to know to recognize it. And this is analogous to the haunting of the jaguar. In order to go into the jungle, and the vine needs to present itself to you. It is not as if you have to survey parts of the jungle and randomly you'll find one. That is not the foundation upon which shamanism is built on. The foundation of shamanism is that of ascribing a spirit to everything. So in shamanism, everything has a spirit, and you will not find an ayahuasca vine unless she is offering herself to you. And after you do that, you need to know how to cook it. And eventually, just like the fourth aspect of meeting the jaguar spirit is having an encounter with the jaguar, in the same way, the final aspect of this medicine, from a very purely ancestral shamanic point of view, is to undergo all of this and eventually drinking the plant, absorbing the plant so that this being is with you and you can feel its effects. Nowadays, people don't need to know the form of the plant or where does it come from. They don't even need to go into the jungle and seek for it. However, if one is serious about this path, at some point to develop a very powerful spiritual link with this medicine, one would try to do things in the manner that I just described. And this is not only valid for ayahuasca, it's valid for all plants. This is not only valid for the jaguar, this is valid for all animals. And in fact, it's also valid for stones. You can do the same with the sacred stones or sacred places in the world in which you pilgrimage to it. And the very pilgrimage itself is like haunting the rock, right? And we also do it with people. We are constantly absorbing people, right? Somebody tells you about this friend, and the first thing they say is the name. And then they tell you, where does it come from? What does he work in? And then you go like, oh, okay, I might want to meet this person. And you go to any social encounter and you finally meet that person. And then you receive the impact of this person's energy and you assimilate it with your very pre-existent belief foundation. And I mean this in the case of any person or friend that you might meet, but it's also the same way in which we would absorb a teacher. You first need a name, then a form of his tradition or where he is or whatever. Then is the haunting, which is imitating or going to find this teacher, and eventually is having a profound heart-to-heart contact. So I think that in this path, we diet many things. The word diet is very important in shamanism. To diet something is to absorb it purely. And we say diet because when you want to absorb something, you want to be in such a focused state of mind that other perceptions do not distract you. Let's say that if I was having this conversation with you, but I am also doing a bunch of other stuff, I'm distracted. I'm not really getting a heart to heart connection. So, in order for myself to completely fall into whatever energy I am looking for, whether it is the energy of a stone, a plant, an animal, or a person, the manner of absorbing this energy is the same. And even though we say that we diet plants, in the same way we can say that we diet stones, animals, and teachers.
Hmm. In that regard, then, what I'm hearing is that plants are teachers. Plants are teaching us something.
100%. I mean, the only distinction that I can make between the four elements I just told you, it is that of that they are elements. So they are related to air, water, earth, and fire. I would say that haunting, not haunting, right? Let's call it absorbing. But if you want to absorb an animal, that animal, to absorb that animal is to fall into the category of air, because just by sight something happens. I did not hunt a jaguar, I did not kill a jaguar, I did not eat a jaguar, but I saw one, and just the sight was changed me. So the transmission through the eyes has to do with air. Now with plants is not enough only to um, to see them. We also need to drink them. So this is related to the air aspect of the wheel of the elements, right? So even though you don't need to drink an animal, but just by its sight, something can happen, and the animal can come to you in dreams. We do need to drink the plants to experience their spirit in us. So they're related to water. Thirdly, when we're talking about stones, stones are, of course, related to the element of earth. And sometimes to even get to a particular sacred stone, one has to walk a lot through a pilgrimage, or maybe climb a mountain, or one has to be very conscious of one's surroundings. And again, the stone is a rock. So we drink plants, we see animals, but it is fundamental to touch stones. At the moment
Hmm.
that we touch them, something happens. The spirit of the stone can be
Hmm.
truly revealed to us. And beautiful.
Yeah, I have the
And
stone here that was given.
And fourthly, I would say that absorbing or dieting teachers falls into the category of fire, because
Mm.
we don't need to merely see the teacher, we don't need to drink the teacher, we don't necessarily need to touch the teacher, but we need to be close to the teacher's fire. We need to listen, to imitate, and to live with them, right? And the aspect of verbal knowledge is something that is out of the category of plants, rocks, or animals, right? And fire is also related to our discursive capacity, in the same way that perhaps Terence McKenna believed this, and many other traditions of the world, Aboriginal traditions of the world, also believed that fire gave us the capacity to speak. In the same case, a teacher, one engages a teacher with the mind, which the fire comes to represent.
Mhm.
So you said that plants are also teachers. Yes, but in a way, teachers are also plants. So we
Mm.
can't say who came first. We can only say, or at least from a shamanic point of view, right? There are other paths that don't diet rocks, they don't diet plants, and they don't diet animals. Although this is not entirely true, because, for example, even in Buddhism, you circumambulate stupas, and stupas are like the sacred stones of Buddhism. And in Islam, you go once in a lifetime at least to the Mecca, etc., etc. Right? And we do drink wine in the Eucharist, and we do keep symbols of the Christ or the Buddhas or etc. So there are ways in which religion has transformed this wheel of the elements by which we learn of nature around us into a purely humane endeavor.
Mm.
So the stupa is a representation of the mind of Buddha, and etc. etc. In all traditions, everything has become sort of, I would say, homocentric, right? Because
Mm.
it relates to the human condition. But we have forgotten also that there are ways to speak to plants. There are ways to be
Mm.
friends with stones. There are ways to have a relationship with animals that perhaps are living as my jaguar is living, thousands of kilometers away. But there is a way to
Mm.
do this. So I would say that this is another aspect which appears to be foundational in shamanism, and that instead of it being a something that came after religion, apparently this was the main way of doing things, and then eventually we transformed animals, stones, and plants into something more humane. So we can
Mm.
talk, for example, of the Holy Grail and drinking the water of life in Christianity, but no one would believe that there is a plant that literally has, life and can give you visions,
Mm.
which is the same thing that the Holy Grail is supposed to do. So it
Mm.
seems that religion has undermined a little bit of our connection with the other elements and has made everything homocentric. And
Mm.
the I would say bringing down this illusion of homocentricity is a fundamental aspect in shamanic training. To abandon this idea that man is the center of the universe and everything is made for us. Um, I mean, the garden of reality was made for us in a way, but we are its guardians. We are not here to abuse and to take whatever we want. And some of the things that the religious framework has allowed is this separation between man and nature, by turning the other elements into something
Mm.
human and relatable to in a human dimension, instead of actually going to the jungle or the desert or the mountains and experiencing nature from a first-hand
Mm.
perspective.
Which we are part of the nature in the first place is remembering probably that we are part of it, like you said.
Yeah,
And
exactly. As
I
long
want to
as
be.
it's very we can always look for teachers in people. of course. But if we fail to see the teachers in everything that surrounds us, then our view will be highly limited.
Hmm. Also, what is the teacher that has passed the test of time? Humans are just a fraction here of the time in the planet. There are ancient organisms that have passed the test of time, and if we're not looking for learning from them, then we're making ourselves a disservice at some point.
Well, that's the same thing that I was saying before with the arrogance that one can be ushered into by disregarding the possibility of standing in the shoulders of giants. As you say, if the history of the world was a clock, humanity, it's only its last minute or seconds, you know.
Exactly.
And if we could learn from organisms that are older than us, that would give us a lot. You know, studying, for example, the way in which my mushroom mycelium uh, spreads, we are finding incredible things that of parts of the kingdoms of life, the five kingdoms of life, that we have completely disregarded because we didn't understand them. Even nowadays, we still fail incredibly at understanding mushrooms. The more you study mycology, the more you understand that we know nothing. And it's a
Hmm.
very mysterious undertaking. So we have,
Yeah.
well, I think that we have made everything into this homocentric idea because it's easier to understand what we can relate to. But also the problem is that we have forgotten how to speak to nature. If we only believe that you can speak to other human beings, then the vessel of your communication is highly limited. But if you have opened ways of speaking with other beings, with plants, with animals, with stones, and with spirits, then you are in a constant conversation. That is what the epitome of the shaman is to me, is this person in the jungle or in the mountains, wherever he is, but he is completely surrounded and nourished and in a constant conversation with nature. And we have lost that. We have lost it mostly by this um, insistence with a homogenization of reality given by scripture. And I love literature, and I've studied most of the religious scriptures that I could get a hold of. But once you begin walking the path of shamanism, you understand that there has been a book that hitherto has not been opened, and that is the book of nature. To be able to open and read the book of nature is another phrase that I would use as a description of what shamanism is. What shamanism is learning to read the book of nature.
Hmm. How you diet plants? What plants are dieted? What are the usages of those ones? And let's talk. Let's do a brief overview of them, please.
I know maybe 100 plants. My teachers perhaps know 1,000, and there are. I would Google it now, but I don't know how many millions of species in the Amazon, and all of them have something to say. All of them. We can make a distinction between psychoactive plants and non-psychoactive plants, and sometimes we call the psychoactive ones teacher plants and the other ones maybe master plants, but really one has to find a way of learning from everything. There is a
Hmm.
story in Zen Buddhism in which a master asked his student to go out and find a plant that had no use, and the student came back after a year and said, I did not find any plant that has no use. And this is also true in shamanism. So there are many plants that I don't know how to use them. There are many plants that I have not dieted. And I've dieted plants that are administered in very different fashions. There are plants that heal the body, right? So, for example, if you cut yourself with a branch, you can apply sangre de grado, and sangre de grado will allow the cicatrix to heal better. In the same way, we can also hurt ourselves in the mind. So instead of applying the balm in the physical body, we apply it in the mind, and the application of that, the balm is the drinking the plant, and the application is the ritual. Um, but there are many plants and many ways of doing these things. You have plants like ohe, which you drink and it makes you purge, it makes you vomit, it also makes you go to the bathroom, and it completely scrapes the wall of the stomach. You can heal yourself from parasites or from other diseases. And so this is not a plant that produces any psycho active function. No, it does not give visions, nothing like this, but it does have healing properties, and you can relate to this plant, uh, and you can relate to its spirit.
Mhm.
So there are plants for everything. There are plants
Mm.
to make you cry. There are plants to make you laugh. There are plants to get you grounded. There are plants to make you airy. There's a huge pharmacopoeia. Let's call it, we can call the Amazon jungle the biggest pharmacy in the world. And the only people that remain with the knowledge of what each plant is for are the native traditions, of which I am lousy student because I know some plants, but under no respect, I am an authority on the different plants that exist in the Amazon. If I were to diet a new plant, I would ask my teachers or something like this. So, to answer your question, I mean, what plants are there? There are so many. I have dieted maybe 40, 45 plants, of which I consider to have a relationship with their spirits. But I don't feel I am even an authority in this because there are
Mhm.
million plants. And I don't think anyone is an authority in this because who can ever know a million plants? We can only know it by a collective storage. And the collective storage are the myths, the transmissions, and the diversity of lineages that exist. If we would have only one lineage, then our knowledge would be circumscribed to one place and to a bunch of plants only. But if you scope the whole area of the Amazon basin, we understand also that it is fundamental to have different lineages because no one person could know all plants. But instead, we can know this from a collective point of view.
Basically, it's a collective effort for research the plants and also transmit the knowledge from their location, from their own experience to their further generations.
Exactly.
Now, let's go specifically into ayahuasca, which is one of the most trendy topics, I would say, here, or maybe ayahuasca, maybe San Pedro or mescaline, which, correct me if I'm wrong, are these two of the most used in shamanic ways, or are they other ones that I know that you have said that there are hundreds of even thousands?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I can tell you what I use the most to treat people, or what my teachers or the lineages I've inherited use. But we cannot say what is the plant that is used most because if you go to Africa, some tribes will say iboga. If you go to Siberia, they will say Amanita muscaria, which is a mushroom. Maybe if you go to Celtic Druids, they will speak about the
Mm.
golden cap mushrooms or the Mayans. Even I don't think them if well we don't have uh, any true line of surviving transmission from the Mayans, but we do have some elements that we know, and they had a huge panoply and spectrum of plants that they were related to. So they used cacao bean was sacred to them, and they used it as money. The sacred mushrooms they called teonanacatl, or the food of the gods. They used oliloki, and they even went to the extent of bringing in plants from other places,
Mm.
because there are shaman that we have found, and ancestral shaman that have been buried with plants like ayahuasca and San Pedro in the same tomb. And ayahuasca and San Pedro grow in completely different conditions. So there was a trade route of medicines. and medicines flew all across the ancient times. I am talking only from the American point of view, but the same we can say in Asia, in Asia Minor, in the Mediterranean, etc. Plants have always been part of the evolution of the human being, and you can find them more often than not in every myth.
In this case, so you mentioned that you use a few of them more often than others. Which ones are those ones that you use to heal, to help heal people?
Well, I wouldn't say that I heal. I accompany the healing process. The plant is the one that heals, but also the plant, if it's a psychoactive substance, it needs to be applied with a ritual. In the same case that in order to apply to heal a cut, you need to put the sangre de grado in the wound and not scrub it in your hair, right? In the same way, the plant needs to be applied to the mind, and the application of the plant in the mind is the ritual. So it is impossible to separate ritual and medicine. If you only take the medicine, it can be dangerous and it cannot be healing. And if you only do the ritual, it is missing its secret ingredient. So ritual and medicine go hand in hand. In this case, I have trained in my life mostly with ayahuasca, huachuma, which is the Quechua name of the San Pedro cactus, and with the sacred mushrooms that I call teonanacatl because of their Mayan lineage. So these are the three medicines that I use the most, but also we can work with other plants, preferably under a retreat fashion. And other plants can be taken to help the process of assimilation of plants like ayahuasca. If you do a long diet with ayahuasca, you will be taking other plants in the jungle, etc., etc. So even if I would say that ayahuasca, huachuma, and tenanacatl are the three main medicines I work with. Um, the coca leaf and the tobacco plant are always somewhat present in every ritual. And there are medicines from the animal, the fungal, and the plant kingdoms. In animal, for example, the Nordic fish sarpa sarpa contains LSD and was used by Vikings. There is a toad called Bufo alvarius and frog called Philomedusa bicolor, which is called Cambo. With mushrooms, you have Amanita muscaria and the very wide range of psilocybin mushrooms. And in the plant kingdom, you have various other plants like, I don't know, Bovinsana, Chirixanango, Toe, Mapajo, Tajibo, Wild Daga, Iboga, etc., etc. Right? So this is a very, very wide subject. But instead of getting ourselves ahead of ourselves and try to collect many names, it is better not to have any of these in the mind and work with the plants or with whatever spirit we're working with one by one, and to fully undergo the process of name, form, haunting, and assimilation that I mentioned, instead of just collecting names, because that's another danger. It's the danger of confusing information with wisdom. And you maybe there are some people that can name many plants, but maybe they don't know them as well. And I, who don't know many plants, if I compare myself to my teachers, um, I have at least tried to develop a deep relationship with each of these instead of trying to know many superficially.
Wow, this is, like you said, a completely vast subject. I'm still thinking that we will have to get a third episode together to go on each one of those ones in essence. Nevertheless, I this is fascinating what that we have gone into what is shamanism, what is religion, how they're related, how a shaman gets tested or tests a teacher. So this is super super cool. Is there any other angle that you would like to touch in the few minutes that we have from the conversation that we've?
Let me see. I mean, if there is a response from people and people have other questions, I not only enjoy very much your questions, but if your audience has any questions and you want to bring them forth for next time, I think that in the same way that we've been talking about going with what works, we also want to tackle the questions that are present. So I love our sessions, and if there are questions from your audience that they ask you that might want to ask me, I am here to serve. If we want to end this conversation with anything that I would like to say is that perhaps we have been touching this subject not from an academic perspective, but perhaps from an intellectual one, right? And it's important for your audience to understand that this is a path that is meant to be walked. Is not so much a story that one is told, but a story that one participates in. And everyone of to walk a shamanic path is to belong in your story and to make nature part of the landscape in which this story is being unfolded. So you began with a beautiful introduction of my person, which, although it's true, I felt like, oh, that's a little bit a lot, and I just don't want to. Don't I would not want people to think that I am just an intellectual or an anthropologist of all of these traditions, but instead that I have undergone their training to the limits of my capacity, and that I have found much more similarities between all of these paths than differences. So, although I think it is important that if anyone is brought into any religion, for this person to find the truth in that religion. Because, for example, there are many people that have been brought into Christianity by their parents, and they became disillusioned from Christianity, and then they went and walked other paths, perhaps shamanism, and then they had a Christian rebirth, and that means that they have a karmic connection with this discipline, with this tradition of Christianity. The same happens with any other tradition. So the fact that I have sought, pursued, assimilated, and can transmit some of the teachings that I received does not mean that one should attempt the same. Um, it is much better to find a teacher and a discipline and go through it completely. It has only been the characteristics of my own personality and idiosyncrasy to have gone across the world to find various teachers, but in under no circumstance I've done this out of a desire to know. I am not really that interested in knowing anymore, and even though I might appear to be knowledgeable in many subjects, the only subjects that we truly know are the ones that we can express silently in ceremony. Whether that ceremony is a Sufi ceremony of dancing dervishes, or it is a meditation ceremony in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, or it is an ayahuasca ceremony in the Amazonian tradition, or a Wachuma ceremony in the Andean tradition, or a Tiananacatl ceremony in the Nahuatl tradition, etc., etc., etc. There are It's very easy for ourselves to become confused, and this is something that I don't wish for your audience. So instead of collecting a lot of these stories, to live our own story is the fundamental thing and the true kernel of wisdom that we will discover. And the last thing that I would say is that effort and faith pay off. And sometimes the longer it takes for us to receive the vision or whatever we're looking for under any of these lineages, The longer we train, it means the longer we suffer. But it also means that the higher our potential is. Because if we need to train more to understand, it means that our limitations are greater. But what does it mean that our limitations are greater? It means that our mind is very complex. So, what we want to do is to bring the complexities of the mind to a halt and to realize the pure simplicity of the ultimate reality. Not speaking in a transcendental fashion as if the ultimate reality was, the throne of God or just a white light vibrating somewhere in the center of the cosmos, but just the pure condition of the vehicle we are inhabiting now with its spectrum of perceptions and in seeing things clearly. So the more complex our mind is, the harder it will be to see things simply. However, once we have experienced this ultimate simplicity of the ultimate reality, as I say, we also have various other capacities to bring people from very different walks of life into this path. So, although for me, my intellectual complexity has been a burden in my path for a very long time because I sought to understand intellectually rather than with experience. After one receives that experience by undermining the whole Tower of Babel of our intellectual complexity, the intellectual complexity, which in the past was a limitation to understand simplicity, it can be used to convey that simplicity to very different and very complex kinds of beings. So, in the same way that I can speak like this to you, which more often than not, we share the same idiosyncratic roots. But I think I have been effective in explaining things like this to a Christian and to a Sikh and to a Buddhist and to a Hindu. And I have only developed that capacity by transforming the limitations of my intellect into something that can give something to others. So I hope that this has been a fruitful voyage to everyone that has been listening. Thank you so much, brother, for your questions and your time. And I hope to see each other soon.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Juan. Like always, it's a pleasure to have conversations with you. The profundity or the depth of our conversations simply helps see life from different angles. Just to finalize, where can people find you? Where online? And also, how is your schedule for the upcoming months, or where should we find it to go and practice shamanism with you?
Yes, I am in the middle of developing a web page at the moment, which will include itinerary, teachings, and various other things that people would be interested. My schedule for the coming year is that I'll be in Bolivia during the month of February, in Peru during the month of March. I will be traveling through Europe in April, May, and June. July, August, and September, I will be in the United States. October, November, and December, I'll be in Tibet, Nepal, and India. And who knows what happens after. But if any of your audience would want to meet me halfway at any point of my never ending shamanic tour, I would be glad to meet you. And if anyone wants my contact, I think I can give it to you. It's my name in Instagram, just Juan Gwar, and I receive comments and requests via that platform for now.
Great. Thank you so much one more time, Juan. And this is not going to be the last time. Definitely, we're going to have more encounters. If you guys enjoyed this conversation with the shaman Xuan Gwar, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to receive notifications for upcoming interviews. That's all for today. Keep learning and keep optimizing. See you next time.